We're turning this week not to a spiritual discipline itself, but to one of the temptations that present to pastors in the spiritual life that is so overwhelming for pastors that I really couldn't just pass up an opportunity for us to reflect on this temptation. It is perhaps, in my estimation, the least understood of the seven deadly sins, yet it is the most pervasive of the seven deadly sins. And as I said, for pastors, this is a particular temptation, and we'll see why in just a moment. We're going to talk about what acedia is, its relationship to our baptismal identity, and what it actually looks like in your spiritual life. And then we're going to connect acedia to what I call pastoral blackout. A lot of books are written about pastoral burnout, and you'll hear that phrase quite often about pastors who just sort of flake out. They get under the stresses of their vocation and they just can't handle it, so they burn out. I don't think it's necessarily burnout. I think it's blackout. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two things in just a minute. Then we're going to have an opportunity for some Visio Divina with Bosch's tabletop of the seven deadly sins. Let's turn to what exactly acedia is. When I say the word sloth, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, sloth is that slow-moving animal. The one that just is, not exerting enough effort, lazy, quite possibly even depressed. To talk about sloth in spiritual terms, at least in our culture, our wider culture, is to equate it with laziness. And that is absolutely not what acedia is. Acedia is not a lack of effort. It is not laziness. Acedia is literally, in the Greek, carelessness. The alpha privative there, meaning not, and you can see cadia there, care, a lack of care. Acedia is not depression. It's not a lack of effort. It's not having done too much that you just kind of give up. Acedia is the absolute refusal to be moved. It is, as the Desert Fathers understood it, the most troublesome of the 8 deadly sins. Because this refusal, it's not just simply you don't care. It is an active refusal to care, an active refusal to be moved. And folks who hit this, folks who succumb to this temptation, particularly pastors, actively don't care. Thomas Aquinas' definition of acedia I could care less. It is within my power. I just refuse to care. And when you think in terms of friendship or marriage, acedia takes that form in relationships when one partner or one person in the relationship actively checks out and actively works against checking in. Marriages and friendships, as we all know, are difficult, and they demand effort. Well, the spiritual life is no different. As you've seen by now, surely, the Christian spiritual life, particularly the spiritual life of pastors, is an incredibly demanding practice. For all of the joys that exist within a marriage, there are burdensome acts. There are things you just simply have to do. The burdensome acts in my marriage, I have to clean the litter boxes and I have to take out the trash. Those are not things that I enjoy doing, but to not do them, to refuse to do them, is an active disengagement with my wife. That's because the things that really count, the things that are really important, demand that we invest our time and ourself into them. Well, the spiritual life is no different. If our relationship with God, if our relationship with the church matters, it will demand of us the investments of our time and ourselves. And there are some folks, there are pastors who just simply refuse, actively refuse to do those things. They refuse to engage with their congregations. That active refusal is a refusal to the demand of the love of God made known in Christ, to which you have been called. And pastors who actively refuse have succumbed to the temptation of acedia. Paul puts it this way: I have been crucified with Christ. The life that I now live, I live by the Spirit of God. And it's not mine. I don't have it. In ordination sermons over the years, I have told candidates for ordination that you are coming before the church to ask us to authorize you for ministry. You surrendered yourself to Christ in baptism. Now we're going to ask you, as an extension of that surrender, to surrender yourself to the church. And in my tradition, and I'm going to reveal something very, very personal here about my own ordination. The most difficult part of my ordination was not what a lot of people think it is. It was not the laying on of hands. Now, a lot of people feel that all of those hands kind of pushing down on you, that's oppressive, and it's an overwhelming moment in the liturgy for ordination. That was not the part I had a problem with. The part I had a problem with was quite early in the ordination when we ask ordinands in our tradition to lay out on the floor in cruciform form, in the shape of a cross. And you're laying out on the floor in front of the altar, in front of the bishop, and you're laying on the floor on your stomach, and you're looking down at the floor of the church, and you want to talk about humbling. To assume a position of crucifixion on the floor of a church in front of hundreds of people who are there to celebrate with you what is supposed to be a big, high, holy moment. And it begins with you on the floor. That's when I knew I was in something over my head. I was in something that was going to take more grace than I would ever be able to muster on my own. My ordained life is made entirely possible because God makes more of my ordination than I make of myself. And acedia's target is that. Acedia's target is the grace that sustains us in our lives. Acedia says you just don't care, don't bother, give up. It's an active disengagement with grace. Acedia says, I may have been crucified with Christ, but it does not make a bit of difference. Nothing has changed. And I am actively going to live my life as if nothing has changed. Our lives lived in grace live in what is now the eternal now, as Tillich put it. That moment where grace, it is, but it is not yet full. And we live in that tension between the now and the not yet. And living in that tension, there will be times when it would be just extremely easy to let that now, that grace that has been made known in your life, the change and the transformation that has resulted, the longing for the fullness to come, it can get to be too much. It can get to be overwhelming. And the delight that is the gospel in our lives can become a burden. And so for some people who just won't actively refuse to carry that burden, actively refuse to carry that cross, they begin to forget who they are. More importantly, they begin to forget whose they are. Over my years working in the bishop's office with clergy, the number one spiritual complaint that I would hear is, it's all too much, so I just got to quit. And the very first thing for me to do is to get some water with the sign of the cross on their forehead. Remember your baptism and be thankful. Pastors bear enormous burdens. Our cross is unlike the cross that a lot of laity will carry. And there are times when that cross just, like Jesus, it overwhelms you and you just stumble. Acedia says you can put it down. You can stop. You don't have to carry this. And so acedia is fundamentally the temptation to say, the love of God I have come to know in Jesus Christ is just too high a demand. And so we find the detachments that we have promised in our ordination vows. We are leaving behind our old self. We have renewed those promises in baptism, in our ordination. And those detachments, well, they're just too tempting. We just give up. Acedia does not mean Jesus Christ was never the Lord of your life. But it does mean you've told him no thanks. I can do better. And this occurs, I think, in one of two ways. A despairing resignation, it's all just too much. Or a despairing escapism. And this is where habits, particularly old habits, die hard. I would not be lying if I were to say that I am almost fully convinced that a good 25% of the clergy in the United States are addicted to porn. And I think that addiction is an active surrender to the temptation of acedia. I think it is an escapism. The temptation of acedia is bearing the cross is just too much. Bearing the cross that pastors have to bear, doubly too much. I could care less, but I just don't. This detachment reveals what is, I think, the restless side of acedia. As John Cassian put it, the same malady, that is acedia, suggests that he should dutifully pay his respects to the brothers and visit the sick, whether at a slight distance or further away. It also prescribes certain pious and religious tasks. Those relatives, male and female, should be looked after, and he should hasten to bring his greetings to them more often. It would be a great and pious work to make frequent visits to that religious woman who is vowed to God and who, in particular, is totally deprived of her relative support, and a very holy thing to bring whatever might be necessary to one who was abandoned and disdained by her own relatives. On such things it behooves him to expend his pious efforts rather than to remain barren and having made no progress in his cell. Pastors are notoriously busy. And one of the ways I am convinced acedia works itself out is to engage in that busyness outside the congregation. Well, I've got all kinds of commitments to the Lions Club. I've got all kinds of commitments to the Shriners, the VFW. I've got prayer breakfasts that I've got to attend. Those are good and honorable things. But if you're doing them so as to just keep busy, you've given in to acedia. Because the things that really matter don't matter. St. Benedict's rule talks about those who wander from monastery to monastery. If you're wandering from congregation to congregation every year or two, stop. That's acedia. A general rule of thumb is you should serve a congregation at least 5 years. When you engage a commitment to a congregation and answer a call, or if your tradition sends you by bishop's orders to a parish, you should anticipate to stay. Because you can't be pastor in just 12 months. It won't happen. And if you think it will, if you think, oh, I can go in, swoop, save the church in 12 months and be on my way, you, my friend, have long succumbed to acedia. Oh, but look at that church. It's growing so much quicker than where I am, and I need to go over there. That's where God's calling me. If the temptation that the grass is greener over there, you've given in to acedia. The commitment to stay and do the hard work. That's the pastoral vocation. That's who we are. And stability in a parish is an awful lot like a marriage vow. It's learning to pay attention to those with whom we share space and time. Remaining committed to a particular congregation is refusing to give in to acedia. Stability in a parish, that's the way of the cross. We need to cultivate the spiritual practice of perseverance, of sticking with it. And that will require courage and it will require zeal. Zeal is this open, honest, dogged love of serving the Lord in that place. And courage is the stick-to-itiveness. The only way you can overcome acedia is through obedience, and charity, and humility. And the only way you will have those is to be formed and transformed in the presence of others. You cannot battle this on your own. It will require a commitment to a spiritual father or a spiritual mother, to a friend, to a bishop, to an elder. You can't go this on your own. In fact, I think acedia is the purest expression of self-love. I am the most important, and therefore I will pay attention to those things that matter to me. And I will neglect all of the rest of my calling and the vocation and the work that goes with it. That's why I think acedia is behind restlessness. I think acedia is behind this lack of commitment to a particular congregation in a particular place at a particular time. This dogged refusal to care is at its heart the most insidious temptation for pastors. Because you can't recognize it on your own. You won't see it when you're in the middle of it, because you will be so turned in on yourself that it will require someone else to say, hey, what's going on? Why does it look like you just don't care? It is that not caring part that is at its heart what makes acedia a temptation. Now the thing is, as soon as you recognize it, as soon as it's called to your attention, the thing you don't do is heap judgment on it. The fundamental liturgical act in overcoming acedia is remembering your baptism. As Aquinas put it, acedia is not sadness about the presence of God himself, but it's a sadness about some good pertaining to him which is divine by participation. Acedia is the things to which God is calling me are so much, and they are. Let's be honest, they are. And they are only possible by God giving of himself to you to sustain the work, to sustain who you are. Your ministry, your spiritual life cannot be sustained by your own power. You can't do it, and if you try it, you will end up here. As Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." When the work gets overwhelming, the place to go is back to Jesus. When it feels like you can't go on any further, go back to Jesus. Because what we call pastoral burnout, it just got to be too much, so I had to quit. It's not burnout, it's blackout. It's forgetting who and whose we are. It's forgetting the grace that sustains the work. As Kathleen Norris puts it, the person afflicted with acedia, even if she knows what is spiritually good for her, is tempted to deny that her inner beauty and spiritual strength are at her disposal as gifts from God. Those tempted to acedia, those tempted to actively disengaging with God and with God's church in ministry, are the ones who have blacked out. They have forgotten who they are. More importantly, they have forgotten whose they are. So the way out is not surrender, is not, oh, I'm done. That's it. The way out is to go back to Jesus. The way out is remember your baptism and be thankful. This is an image from the 16th century, and it depicts all of the 7 deadly sins. I want you to spend some time with this image. Where do you see yourself here? Ask God to show you. If you need to pull it up on Google, pull up the image, spend some time with it, stop the video, and ask God to show you what you need to see. If I've been describing you, and this is a bit too close to home, and it's what you need to look at, there's some great resources out there. I would recommend um, the one there on the left, or Glittering Vices on the right. Um, those are some great books. But probably the most accessible treatment is Kathleen Norris's Acedia and Me. That's just a wonderful book, especially if you're struggling here. The other two are really important books about our culture and where we are as Christians in the middle of our culture. Great resources to begin to evaluate how you see what we've been talking about in relationship to the wider culture. I don't have any doubts that there are going to be some questions or some concerns as we gather together, so be sure to jot those down. Um, Jot down how you interacted with that image, Boss's tabletop, so that we can come together and talk about those things.